Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and I'll be hosting today's show once again. Up first, fire danger, and not a lot on here with all the continuous precipitation around much of mainland Alaska last few days. Some areas of high fire danger showing up there, western Brooks Range and even over the western North Slope, and down toward Buckland there. That's mostly due to gusty winds and sunshine, dry conditions, winds gusting as high as 36 miles an hour at Point Hope and 28 miles an hour at Cape Lisburne. Kelly had gusts 25 miles an hour, so that's created some areas of high fire danger in that location. Otherwise, Northway Tok area there, high fire danger, where Tok reached 74 at mid-afternoon today, and then some areas in the Copper River Basin also in the high category with dry conditions, temperature in the lower 70s there. And that area south of the Yukon River, that's really a stretch. They've had some rain all along there in the last 24 hours, but still could be an area of high fire danger there just south of the Yukon in the shaded area. Otherwise, moving on to the hazardous weather graphics, there are no watches, warnings, or advisories out anywhere in the state here for the next day or so. There is a gale warning for the North Gulf Coast through tonight, and that due to a storm system that's lifting northward and creating pretty gusty east winds. Have increased 40 to 45 miles an hour in gusts at Middleton Island this afternoon, and again, gale warnings are out through tonight for that area, with possible gusts of 50 miles an hour. Otherwise, rain beginning to push into Yakutat. It was kind of a drier day today across the southeast coast with some ridging. In fact, it's precipitation free down over the southern panhandle, with generally to the north in the last 12 hours only about less than 1/10 of an inch fell. Like at Juneau at about 7/100 of an inch, but that'll be increasing tonight as that front pushes inland with southwest flow. So you're still in a wet weather pattern there, at least for another couple of days. Otherwise, in the interior, isolated thunderstorms breaking out near or over the northern Kuskokwim Valley, and just a couple of lightning strikes by mid-afternoon reported around Fairbanks. So nothing really widespread as far as thunderstorms go, but notably cloud-free after some morning low clouds and fog on the North Slope, and then with those gusty east-northeast winds along the northwest coast, clear skies, VFR flying. You can see there from roughly Kivalina on up around Cape Lisburne and to Point Lay, with looks like clear skies almost up to the Arctic coast, even on the east side, but a few clouds over there on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, but the eastern North Slope looked pretty good in toward Arctic Village and down into the upper Yukon Flats area. Also, some clearing occurred along the lower Yukon River from the Seward Peninsula. You can see some clearing there extended all the way down to Bethel, and also in the Copper River Basin, some clearing, and over the eastern interior. Again, with Northway reporting 74 degrees, Fairbanks had about 70 degrees. Otherwise, rain fell with that system across Kodiak Island. They picked about half an inch in the last 12 hours there, and even heavier amounts fell at, or as much as a third of an inch, not heavier, a third of an inch fell at King Salmon, and Sitka picked up about a third of an inch of precipitation. That was really in the last 24 hours, and they have made less than that today. It was kind of a drier condition today. And light rain, fog, and drizzle with a weak trough fell along the Alaska Peninsula area. And rain is beginning to taper off Kodiak Island, especially over the southwest part of the island, probably ending now as you get in more of a northwest wind flow there. And then, again, a few breaks over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area. and rain along the North Gulf Coast, continuing with the increasing east winds there, Middleton Island again, with moderate rain at 3 p.m. And areas of rain there just south of the Yukon River area from Eagle, extending westward to that trough with some isolated thunderstorm activity along with that. The Bering Sea generally cloudy with light winds, high pressure dominating the central Bering Sea, and a weak front pushing light rain, fog, and drizzle eastward to Shimian Attu. Wind's not much of a factor with that, maybe 20 miles an hour, 20 knots. Otherwise, pretty much cloudy and not much going on for the Aleutians. And looking at the forecast for tonight, that front brings some good solid rain into the Panhandle from Dixon entrance northward into the northern inside waters, and rain possibly heavy at times for Yakutat with gale warnings that I mentioned along the coastal water areas there along the coast, eastern North Gulf Coast especially, for 35-knot winds. Sustained rain increases over the Copper River Basin, may spill in north of the eastern Alaska Range in toward Northway and Tok, but probably won't make it as far north as Eagle. Showers linger over the west central interior, but north from the trough axis northward should stay dry. Risk of some light rain, snow, or fog for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast, but whatever falls will be quite light. Fog and drizzle, St. Lawrence Island with a weak trough there, and about the same thing for Nunivak Island, but variably cloudy for the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area, as well as Bristol Bay with decreasing showers, but lingering over the Aleutian Range. High pressure continues to hold over the southern Bering Sea, actually the central Aleutians, and some moisture slipping eastward in westerly flow into the central Bering Sea, so drizzle and fog tending to increase in that front, trying to push eastward. We'll see tomorrow a little bit stronger system pushes west-southwest to Shimian Attu, so look for winds to come up to small craft advisories tomorrow afternoon for the western Aleutians. Low clouds, fog, and drizzle. Really not much change over the Bering Sea except for increasing moisture flowing eastward in toward the Pribilofs. Otherwise, a day much like today for southern Alaska, except more rain for the Panhandle and diminishing rain, definitely lighter winds for the North Gulf Coast, and again, isolated thunderstorms possibly developing over the interior, eastern upper Tanana Valley, and maybe as far south as the Talkeetnas, and stays a little damp on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, low clouds and fog, mostly along or off the Arctic coast, and partly mostly sunny but less windy for the northwest part of the state and western Arctic coast. Pushing ahead to Tuesday, there's a stronger system pushing into the western Aleutians with 25 to 30 knot winds associated with that, and some pretty good rainfall and fog with IFR conditions. I'll be pushing in toward Adak late in the afternoon. Otherwise, from Atka eastward, light winds, low clouds, areas of fog, and now some moisture on the increase should spread into the Pribilofs for kind of an IFR cloudy, damp, foggy kind of summer day for the Pribilofs there, and some showers over the Auckland Mountains. Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula, especially the southern Seward Peninsula, looks a little cloudy and damp, and areas of rain, isolated thunderstorms for the Kenai Peninsula possible in the eastern Copper River Basin. Rain changes showers for the Panhandle. Lows tonight, lower to mid-30s Arctic coast, north slope, otherwise 40s and 50s for the remainder of the state, with lower to mid-50s for the Panhandle, mostly in the upper 40s or mid to upper 40s for the Aleutians and Pribilofs, although Savunga down to 43. Highs for tomorrow, about like today, pushing up to the lower 70s around the greater Fairbanks area and the Kobuk, Koyukuk Valley areas, and could push 70 out toward Noatak and King Salmon as well, and get a day much like today for the Susitna Valley with upper 60s to lower 70s, upper 50s to lower 60s for the Panhandle. And we back that one up. Northwest winds will push the temperature up to 72 at Kodiak. And for the lows Tuesday morning, lower to mid-30s again north of the Brooks Range, with mid-50s for the south central Alaska area and the central Tanana Valley, lower to mid-50s for the Panhandle. Highs 40 to 45 for the Arctic coast, and 67 to 73 Matanuska Susitna Valley. Again, lower 70s for Kodiak Island, near 70 the Copper River Basin. Otherwise, 50s and 60s for the Bering Sea and Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather for Monday morning, much of the interior will be VFR right on down through Cook Inlet to Kodiak Island, as well as Dillingham, Togiak, and the northern half of the Seward Peninsula. and northwest coast. Arctic coast has some threatening areas of IFR for the central and east side, and the Bering Sea, quite a batch of IFR there from the Pribilofs westward and then southward across Kiska and Amchitka. But marginal VFR for most of the Aleutians, and a band of IFR sliding into Shimi and Attu. And IFR right along the southeast coast, in fact, all the way across the northern inside waters for the morning, and then that will continue to increase, and it'll be IFR all of the southeast coast in the afternoon, all the way back to possibly Cordova. Prince William Sound, though, marginal VFR, Kenai Peninsula marginal, and areas of IFR in the afternoon possible for the Talkeetnas, Eastern Alaska Range, and the Western Alaska Range, Nulato Hills. Widespread IFR for the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, and IFR right along the Arctic coast. Marginal VFR now extending southward to the north slope, or just almost to the crest of the Brooks Range. And for Tuesday morning, IFR for the Arctic coast and most of the north slope down to the Brooks Range, Kobuk, Koyukuk Valley, Upper Yukon into the Upper Tanana Valley should be VFR, but south of the White Mountains, though, looks to be marginal. And then as you approach the Alaska Range, look for IFR flying conditions, and they'll be pretty widespread over the Copper River Basin into Prince William Sound, Talkeetna Mountains, and Panhandle, IFR. Prince of Wales Island, though, marginal. Bering Sea, solid IFR, except for the northern areas around St. Matthew Island. You get some breaks there, and then back to the IFR from the north shore of St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait, Seward Peninsula. And for the afternoon, VFR, northwest coast, much of the Brooks Range, western north slope, and we've got a zone of IFR there, Yukon River, and then south of the flats there, and then angling back down to the southeast along the eastern Alaska Range. IFR Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, IFR for the Panhandle, and widespread IFR continues for the Aleutians and the Bering Sea, right on up to the Bering Strait, with VFR flying conditions. A little more sun for south central Alaska, Susitna, Manuska Valley, Iliamna Lake area, right on down Kachemak Bay and Kodiak Island. Passes for Monday. Anaktuvik, VFR, marginal VFR in the northern entrance. Same pattern for Adigan, marginal VFR possible northern entrance, otherwise VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill, occasionally marginal tomorrow, especially in the afternoon. And for rainy, marginal VFR with possible IFR in the western entrance. Windy, though, I think will be VFR. And then Isabel, starting out VFR, trending toward marginal VFR with buildups and possible thunderstorm. And that same pattern also from Intasta, starting out VFR becoming marginal, risk of a thunderstorm. Tanita, VFR becoming marginal, isolated thunderstorm possible. And for Portage, marginal VFR at times throughout the day. Chilkoot and White, IFR. And the freezing levels, still cold air along the eastern Arctic coast there, cold air aloft, about 2,000 feet, and the surface really close by there along the eastern stretch of the Beaufort Sea coast. Otherwise, up to 8,000 feet south side of the Brooks Range, 10,000 feet North Gulf Coast, 12,000 southern Panhandle, and the Bering Sea, 8 to 10,000 feet. Icing, look for considerable moderate rime icing for the North Gulf Coast and southern Kenai Peninsula, with areas of mixed icing over the interior, and then a batch of rime icing of the mostly light variety trying to push into the western Aleutians. Jet stream, upper level lows across the Bering Sea, with one passing across southern Alaska tomorrow, and the jet right along the Aleutians up Alaska Peninsula and then cutting in across the southeast coast. And that cold upper low west of Banks Island producing 50-knot westerlies along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And at 9,000 feet, strongest winds south of the area, really not much in the way of any significant winds around at 9,000 feet. Same pattern at 3,000 feet, although westerlies 35 knots are on the south side of that Gulf of Alaska low. And northerlies, northeasterlies, western Arctic coast, could translate into isolated moderate chop in that area, as well as the northeastern North Gulf Coast.
So that Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. But what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was the result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. But the water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015. And the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high impact weather events.
We know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early meltout. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Today's sea ice analysis, not much different from yesterday's. Looks like an area of sea ice-free water there extending westward off the eastern Beaufort Sea coast there, a ways off the coastline. Otherwise, not a lot of change. Looks like some heavier ice also found its way southward to just off the Point Barrow area. And from there, looking at coastal water forecasts for the Panhandle, South Coast, southwest winds 15 knots with 9-foot seas, south to southwest winds at 20 for the North Coast, seas 9 feet, and pretty gusty winds for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal, sustained southerlies at 20 knots with gale force gusts at 35 knots in both locations, Clarence Strait southeast at 20 with 3-foot seas. And then for Tuesday, for the inside waters, light variable winds at 10 knots with seas 2 feet or less, and west-northwest winds on the south coast at 10 knots with 7-foot seas, and westerlies at 5 to 10 knots on the north coast with 6 to 7-foot seas. And for Cook Inlet, northern Cook Inlet, southwest breeze at 10, but south of the Forelands, we'll have 20-knot winds from the southwest, and then small craft advisories are Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. West winds 25 knots, sea 7 to 8 feet. Western North Gulf Coast, northwest at 15. East side there, Middleton Island, northeast at 15 with 7-foot seas, and north 15 for Prince William Sound. Those will become light westerlies at 10 knots for the Sound, southwest at 10 for the eastern North Gulf Coast, picking up to 20 knots from the west as you head west, and then small craft advisories once again for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, westerlies at 25 knots. Cook Inlet, southwest wind 10 to 15 knots. Kodiak Island on the east side, west 20 knots. Chillicothe Strait, southwest 20 knots. And then Bristol Bay looking at westerly winds at 20 knots with 3-foot seas. And the Alaska Peninsula, west winds 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 5-foot seas. For Tuesday, Bristol Bay, west winds at 20 knots, and Chillicothe Strait, Kodiak Island, west winds 20 knots, 4 to 6-foot seas. West-southwest winds for the Alaska Peninsula at 15 knots with seas 2 to 4 feet. And for the Fox Islands tomorrow, generally west winds at 10 knots, pretty light with 1 to 5-foot seas. Light southerly winds, Adak and Atka, 2 to 4-foot seas, and then picking up to 25 knots from the south and seas building to 8 feet from Kiska westward. And those small craft advisories with that stronger frontal system will expand eastward to Adak and Atka in the late afternoon, 25 knots and 25 to 30 knot winds for the western Aleutians, but for Unalaska Island, winds stay light out of the south at 10 knots with 2 to 4 foot seas. For the southwest coast, west winds 10 to 15 knots, 2 to 3 foot seas. Light southerly winds for the Pribilofs with 2 foot seas. Same thing for St. Matthew Island, St. Lawrence Island, northwest at 20 with 5 foot seas, and southwest at 10 for Norton Sound. Then west 15 for Norton Sound on Tuesday. St. Lawrence Island, northwest at 20 with 4 foot seas. Southwest coast, west 15 knots. Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, looking at south winds continuing light at 10 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas. And for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, light northerly winds at 10 knots, seas 2 feet, over toward Kaktovik, Demarcation Point, Barter Island, northwest at 15. Small craft advisories continue tomorrow from Point Ley all the way down to Wales for northeast winds becoming north from Cape Thompson to Wales at 25 to 30 knots. And then for Tuesday, from Wales to Cape Thompson, north 25 knots, Cape Thompson, Cape Beaufort, northeast 25, and then down to 15 knots for the western Arctic coast, north 10 on the central coast, northwest 10 to 15 on the east side with 1 to 2 foot seas. For tonight, again, rain increases along all of the panhandle, and gale warnings remain out tonight for the eastern North Gulf Coast for east winds gusting to as high as 50 miles an hour. Rain increases over the Copper River Basin and eastern Kenai Peninsula and may push as far west as Anchorage and Palmer. But to the west, farther west, it'll be drier, and it will be dry for the northern third of the state. No change in the Bering Sea. And for Monday, small craft advisories come into the picture for the far western Aleutians, and a day much like today for much interior Alaska. Rain continues the entire day for the Panhandle, followed by rain changing to showers, but continued damp for the southeast coast, and chance of thunderstorms, Kenai Peninsula, northeast Copper River Basin. Have a great evening.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.